Mark chapter 5, verses 25 to 34. Now a certain woman had had flow of blood for 12 years, and had suffered many things from many physicians. She had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his garment, for she said, "If only I may touch his clothes, I shall be made well." Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that the power had gone out of him, turned round in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging about you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see who had done this thing. But the woman, in fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and knelt down before him, and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, and be healed of your affliction." Unclean, unclean, unclean. That was me. It wasn't really a life, more an existence, and a miserable existence at that. I was tired all the time. I was getting weaker and weaker and weaker. I had no energy, no joy or zest for life. Some days I could only lie on my bed all day. All the time I was bleeding, bleeding, bleeding. The life seemed to be slowly ebbing out of me. I was desperate for a cure, for the bleeding to stop. I went to doctor after doctor. Each one tried a different treatment, painful, degrading operations, or horrible potions. Each time I had hope that this doctor would be the one to cure me. This treatment would be the right one for me. But it never worked. It just made me worse, if anything. I got worse and worse and worse. Eventually, that problem had gone away because I had no money left for any more doctors. I scarcely had enough for food. The bleeding, the weakness, and the tiredness were bad enough, but they were not the worst things. My complaint, my problem meant that I was regarded as ceremonially unclean. People believed that anyone who touched me, anything I touched, became defiled. I wasn't allowed in the synagogue. I wasn't allowed to worship with my people. I was cut off from fellowship with anyone else. I desperately wanted to be part of God's covenant with his people, but my bleeding had cut me off. I longed for a sense of acceptance from God, to be close to him, but I did not have it. I was unclean, an outcast from society, and, it seemed, from God. It seemed I was as low as a woman could get. Unclean, unclean, unclean. That was me. I'd heard stories of a great prophet, a teacher from God, who some were saying might even be the Messiah. Apparently God was performing miracles, healing the sick, even other unclean people like lepers. I heard of his great teaching and the parables that he was telling. Although I'd never met him, I sensed that he was God's man. His name was Jesus. I knew that he was my only hope. Next time I came to town, I went to where he was. I stood well back. But I listened to his teaching, saw his power, and knew that yes, he definitely was the one sent by God. When he started to make a move, I knew my time had come. I quietly, my face covered as much as I could, and unobtrusively made my way into the crowd, making sure that nobody noticed me. Eventually I got near enough to touch him. I knew that if I just touched him, I would be healed. Such was his power, his holiness. I reached out and gently touched the edge of his cloak, hoping that he wouldn't notice. Immediately, I felt that my bleeding was stopped, and I knew that I was healed. But to my horror, he stopped. He asked who had touched him. I shrank back into the crowd, fearing his anger for defiling him. He persisted in asking, so I had no option but to come forward and tell him all. But instead of anger, I got love. I was told that I was healed, that my faith had made me a whole, complete woman again. What was more, he called me daughter. I was the only person he ever called daughter. What a transformation. From an outcast from God's people to being daughter. I was unclean and defiled, cut off from God, but one touch of Jesus, and I was clean, clean, clean. Luke chapter 19, verses 1 to 10. Then Jesus entered and passed through Jericho. Now behold, there was a man named Zacchaeus, who was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. And he sought to see who Jesus was, but could not because of the crowd, for he is of short stature. So he ran ahead and climbed to a sycamore tree to see him, for he was going to pass that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and saw him and said to him, Zacchaeus, make haste and come down, for today I must stay at your house. So he made haste and came down and received him joyfully. When they saw it, they all complained, saying, He's gone to be a guest with a man who is a sinner. Then Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, Look, Lord, I give half of all my goods to the poor, and if I have taken anything from anyone by the false accusation, I restore fourfold. And Jesus said to him, Today salvation has come to this house, because he also is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and save that which was lost. Unclean, unclean, unclean. That was me. I'd always been unpopular. I suppose I was unclean from my own deliberate choice. It all went back to my childhood. I was much smaller than the other boys, and they used to pick on me and call me names. They would never let me join the gang. I used to pretend that I didn't care, but of course I cared very much. I felt lonely and miserable. As I grew up, I tried to compensate for this lack of acceptance and loneliness by making money and by accumulating possessions. It was the only satisfaction that I could get. That's why I became a tax collector. I could get rich. Particularly as I didn't really care how I made money. I would cheat, lie and extort. I would take bribes. I'd fiddle both the people and the government. Each time I made something dishonestly, I'd feel satisfaction for a short time, but it would soon go. I knew that what I was doing was wrong. I knew that it displeased God. Everybody would avoid me. They knew what sort of man I was, and that I was working for the occupying Romans. I was cut off from my people. But what was worse, I was cut off from God. My lifestyle, my occupation, my cheating and my fraud made me unclean. I could not enter the synagogue or join in the prayers of the community. People felt defiled by contact with me, particularly the religious people. The Pharisees said that any house that I entered was defiled. I wanted to be a part of the covenant people of God, but by my lifestyle choice, I couldn't be. Unclean, unclean, unclean. That was me. I'd heard of a prophet and preacher by the name of Jesus who was going around teaching marvellous things and performing wonderful miracles. It sounded like he was someone special, the Messiah, the Son of God. I wanted to see him, but I knew how bad and undeserving I was, how unclean I was. He was so holy, and I was so unholy. impure and sinful. I thought that he'd have no time for me. I knew that I was completely unworthy of being in the presence of anyone from God, but I still wanted to see him. I heard he was coming to town, so I crept into the crowd, making sure that nobody would notice me. I was too short to see over other people's heads, and I knew that if I asked to be allowed to the front, people would notice me and not make room. Perhaps if I'd have been a better person, a more popular person, they'd have let me through to the front. But I knew they wouldn't. Suddenly I noticed a tree and had an idea. I ran to the tree and climbed up, hiding in the branches. An ideal solution. I'd be able to see him, but he wouldn't be able to see me and start telling me how sinful I was, which I already knew, like all the other religious people did. The crowd around was getting more and more excited, and so was I. Then suddenly he was right under me as he walked along his way. But then he stopped and looked up into the tree. A huge range of emotions ran through me: fear, excitement, joy, guilt. Then he spoke. He spoke to me. He didn't start berating me like all the other religious people did, but he told me that he was coming to my house. My house? Didn't he know what sort of man I was? It seems that he did, but I knew that I would cheat and steal no more. I promised to make good all that I had stolen. Then he said words that I thought I would never hear. Today is salvation come to this house, for so much as he also is the son of Abraham. A son of Abraham. Me. I was unclean and defiled, cut off from God. But one touch of Jesus, and I was clean, clean, clean.